Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Manny Ramirez. I will be the moderator for today's briefing. I'm a second generation Cuban American born and raised in Florida and currently a PhD candidate in sociology, researching the effects of US policy and US policy on Cuban migration. And I'm also a member of the ACERE Advisory Board. So ACERE stands for the Alliance for Cuban Engagement and Respect. We are a coalition of organizations and individuals throughout the United States who believe that maintaining economic sanctions, which we find disproportionately affect the Cuban people, do not help resolve the conflicts and ideological differences between our two nations. So ACERE's mission is to channel grassroots advocacy into progressive policy changes that promote positive and respectful relations between Cuba and the United States. And we welcome everyone to this congressional briefing, which is titled Cuban Migration and U.S. Policy, Implications and Options for the Biden Administration. In today's briefing, leading experts and analysts will discuss the root causes of migration from Cuba to the United States and what changes can be made to U.S. policy to better manage this migration. So in the last 3 years or so, what we've seen is over 700,000 or so Cubans have attempted to migrate to the United States. To put that in perspective, 200,000 Cubans migrated to the US in the 10 years following the 1959 Cuban Revolution. And the numbers from these past 3 years is also more than the number of Cubans who migrated to the US between 2010 and 2019, right? In which that number in that decade was 479,000, right? So just in the past few years, we're seeing almost or over 700,000 Cubans migrating to the US. So an economic crisis rivaling and perhaps surpassing the worst years of the special period, which was the economic depression Cuba faced in the 1990s, has fueled the number of Cubans leaving in recent years. But what is driving the economic crisis? Why does the United States continue to be a top destination for Cuban migrants? And what can be changed about US policy to alleviate migration? Here, I will provide some quick context that will help orient our understanding of the issues before we turn to today's panelists. So it's important to understand that significant migration from Cuba to the United States has existed even before the 59 Cuban Revolution. However, favorable U.S. migration policies set for Cuban migrants after the Revolution of '59 helped maintain the United States as a top destination of choice for Cubans seeking to leave the island. So policies such as the Cuban Refugee Program of 1961, the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966, these encouraged Cubans to migrate to the U.S. by offering educational opportunities, housing assistance, low interest loans, and other forms of material support, as well as a relatively smoother path to U.S. citizenship. And for the most part, these policies continue to benefit Cuban migrants relative to other migrant groups, as we'll hear more about today. And so following the Obama administration's pro-engagement approach, the Trump administration's quote unquote maximum pressure policy added hundreds of new sanctions on Cuba, returned Cuba to the state sponsor of terrorism list, and closed the U.S. embassy in Havana, adding onto existing hardships resulting from the over 60-year-old trade embargo. And then we came to see the COVID-19 pandemic and its devastating impacts as well, which led to the shutdown of Cuba's tourism industry for almost 2 years. Of course, the tourism industry being Cuba's biggest sort of economic generator. And so while the Biden administration has taken some productive steps in engaging with Cuba, such as reauthorizing remittances and reopening the U.S. Embassy in Havana, overall, what we've seen is that the current administration has more so resembled the Trump administration's approach to Cuba compared to the approach of the Obama administration. And so, for example, under the Biden administration in 2021, the U.S. Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, which is, of course, the office that oversees sanctions enforcement, identified Cuba sanctions as its, quote, most comprehensive sanctions program. And important to note, leaders in the region have criticized U.S. sanctions as a core factor for mass migration. Just last year, leaders from 12 Latin American and Caribbean nations developed a joint agreement to address migration issues, which included calling for the end of sanctions and coercive measures that fuel economic crises that also lead to emigration. So our speakers for today will further explain the root causes of Cuban migration and explore what can be changed about U.S. policy to address these issues. We have a few guiding questions leading us today. First, how does migration from Cuba compare to the rest of the region? Why have hundreds of thousands of Cuban migrants come to the U.S. over the past 3 years? And what role do U.S. policies and sanctions play in that? How has the Biden administration responded to these issues? And we'll also explore what steps the administration can take to address the root causes that we'll be talking about and better manage migration from Cuba. And so the agenda for today, we're actually going to be starting with a message from our keynote speaker, who's Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. And then that will be followed by some short presentations from a distinguished group of panelists. So we'll be hearing from Maria Jose Espinosa, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Engagement and Advocacy in the Americas. We also have Rafael Bernal, Latino politics reporter for The Hill. We have Denise Delgado Vasquez, research coordinator at University of Massachusetts in Boston. And then due to a prior commitment, we no longer have Jose Pertira joining us today. But however, in his place, we are lucky to have Dr. Susan Eckstein, who is the former president of the Latin American Studies Association and a prominent scholar on Latin American immigration, including Cuban immigration to the US. And so important to remember for the folks in attendance, we will be having a Q&A dedicated for the last 15 minutes or so of today's briefing. So attendees, audience members, you have a chance to ask questions to our fabulous guest speakers. So feel free to type your questions into the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll get to those at the end of discussion. We should have some time to at least get to a few of those. And then we'll conclude with some calls to action from ACERE and reviews the steps that can be taken to alleviate these root causes of migration for Cubans. Okay. And so with that, we're going to, in a second, turn to our keynote speaker, who again is Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. Elected in 2016 and now serving her 4th term in Congress, the Congresswoman represents Washington's 7th district, which encompasses most of Seattle and its surrounding areas. She is the first South Asian American woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and one of only 24 naturalized citizens currently serving in the United States Congress. Congresswoman Jayapal is a member of the House Judiciary Committee, where she serves as ranking member of the Subcommittee on Immigration Integrity, Security, and Enforcement. She also serves on the House Education and the Workforce Committee. She is the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which represents nearly 50% of the entire Democratic caucus. And Representative Jayapal recently traveled on a delegation to Cuba, where she witnessed firsthand the economic and humanitarian challenges the island is facing, as well as the role of U.S. policies in contributing to these difficulties and the need for diplomatic engagement. So with that, I'll turn it over to the Congresswoman. Please take it away. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Manuel, and to all of the folks at ACERE for hosting this important conversation. I think it's actually perfect timing for us to be talking about the path forward. As you covered in your opening, right now, Cuba finds itself in terrible crisis, a humanitarian disaster that is affecting ordinary Cubans' ability to feed themselves, to receive adequate medical care, to grow crops, to access reliable energy, really on every front. A combination of COVID lockdowns, a sharp decline in tourism, internal economic issues with management by the Cuban government, and Trump's maximum pressure sanctions policy have contributed to Cuba's most severe humanitarian and migratory crisis in decades. As you mentioned, I'm the ranking member on the Immigration Subcommittee, and I look at many things from this lens. And you cannot but fail to see that over 600,000 Cubans have come to the United States since 2021, many living in legal limbo, putting challenges on an already broken immigration system. Individual American tourists still can't visit Cuba. Investors can't freely support Cuban entrepreneurs and the private sector. And we are seeing a dramatic breakdown of Cuban society just 90 miles south of our southern border. As you mentioned earlier this year, and I really want to give an enormous thank you to Maria Jose Espinoza, who helped us arrange this CODEL, where I traveled to Cuba with Representative Ilhan Omar as chair of the Progressive Caucus and as ranking member of the Immigration Subcommittee. I wanted to be able to see the situation for myself and be a part of helping to develop strategies for federal lawmakers to address these issues of mutual concern for both of our countries. It was just so clear to me that our misguided U.S. economic policies have been disastrous. And it was very sobering to see just simple things like, empty pharmacies, shelves on pharmacies without any essential medicines, medical facilities that are really so advanced in Cuba without necessary equipment to do the work. And then, of course, the food lines and the food scarcities, and to be able to visit families in their homes and hear about the challenges, and also to hear from people who have been trying to stick it out because they want to stay in Cuba, and they believe that it should be possible for Cuba to be successful again. And yet they are being pushed by economic circumstances, by fear of what some consider to be a very repressive regime in terms of some freedom of speech that came out of the last protest rallies. But on every front, it was just clear to me how counterproductive and dangerous our US sanctions have been for Cuba, but also for our country's relationships with European and Latin American allies whose citizens and governments are directly impacted by these punitive measures. In 1960, a classified State Department memo stated that, quote, every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba, end quote. That memo also explicitly outlined that the goals of broad-based U.S. sanctions were to, quote, deny money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of the government, end quote. I believe, and the Progressive Caucus, members of the Progressive Caucus from Representative Jim McGovern to Representative Barbara Lee and many in between, have been at the forefront of pushing a very different vision. And we believe that it is past time for us all to accept that these punitive policies, the sanctions, and the placing of Cuba on the state sponsor of terrorism list are incredibly cruel to ordinary Cubans and absolutely counterproductive to our US interests. Now, I want to be clear that I do have real concerns about human rights in Cuba. That's been my life, is fighting for human rights around the world, including in the United States. And on my trip, I did meet with families of those who were imprisoned following the J11 protests. And these families underscored the urgent humanitarian issues and concerns about freedom of expression, civil and political liberties. And at the same time, we have to recognize that the United States can address those concerns surrounding human rights, as well as the concerns around humanitarian conditions and democratic practices, while supporting the Cuban people through smart policy, diplomacy, and dialogue, not through sanctions and the blackballing of Cuba and any possibility of even building the private sector enterprise with our sanctions and with the SSOT designation. I have worked very hard on this behind the scenes with the Biden administration. We have been pushing, we pushed early on for some of the initial steps that were announced to reverse these harmful policies, including removing some financial restrictions on Cuban entrepreneurs and recognizing cooperation between our country's law enforcement. But even some of the steps that were announced have not yet been implemented. And just yesterday, I was speaking with the Treasury Department about what is taking so long to even put those smaller steps into practice. So we are continuing to advocate for that. But I don't believe that that is nearly enough to ease the current humanitarian crisis and to ensure that we are going to be that we do not have a failed state 90 miles south of the border, a state that is very important to our Latin American allies and some of our European allies. And so I believe very firmly that we need to remove Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. This is a designation that was inappropriately made in the last days of the Trump administration. And it has triggered these very broad financial sanctions. It has cut off Cuba's access to international banking and world markets. And we had been told in Congress, many of us that have been advocating for this, that the process to remove the designation was underway and that the Biden administration was looking at this designation that was made in the very last days of the Trump administration. And last December, we found out that, in fact, that process to remove the designation had not even begun. And so we have continued to put both public and private pressure on the administration to recognize that there's actually not much that needs to be done because the Trump designation never went through the kind of review process that it should have gone through. And the Biden administration can remove that designation quickly. I also believe it's critical that we break with the Trump administration and rejoin previous administrations to waive Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, which expanded the embargo by creating major legal liabilities and damages for potential U.S. and foreign investors in Cuba. It really chilled foreign direct investment. And this was one of the things that we on our trip, we were able to speak with many just incredible small entrepreneurs. I will say some of them had different opinions about the Cuban government and different opinions about views on the Cuban government, but all of them made it clear that the fact that that they have not been able to get the kind of investments that are exactly what people have been looking for to sort of build the private sector and the public-private partnerships in Cuba, that those are simply not possible without us addressing the sanctions and and all of the issues around the SSOT list. And so I believe we also need to lift all restrictions on travel to Cuba by American citizens and legal residents, and we should end Trump's what was called the restricted entities list of hotels, stores, and tourist agencies and prohibited accommodations. We were not able to stay in some of the very important places in Cuba because they were on that restricted entities list. Lastly, as the ranking member of the Immigration Subcommittee, I have advocated to the administration to do all it can to expand legal pathways, and President Biden did do that in creating the CHNV, the Cuba, Honduras, Nicaragua, Venezuela Humanitarian Parole Program. That program should be expanded in addition to continued improvements to ensure a working immigration system. And we advocated very hard to resume non-immigrant visa processing at the U.S. Embassy in Havana and to reopen the refugee section so that we can further manage migration in a safe and orderly manner. But my core issue around immigration is that we should enable Cubans to be able to stay in Cuba, not necessarily to migrate. I don't think that is in the interest of Cuba or in the interest of the United States. And so to do that, again, we have to address these deeper barriers that have been put in place by the Trump administration, but frankly continued by the Biden administration, much to my dismay. So this is the time to build greater educational, commercial, and cultural cooperation with Cuba. It is a very important country. We were incredibly impressed. I worked in public health for a long time before my immigrant rights work and before coming to Congress. And just to see the skill and the thoughtfulness of the medical system in Cuba, the way it's been able to help countries around the world in public health crises, and the loss of so many skilled and talented doctors who have had to leave Cuba because there simply isn't an economic way anymore to be able to make ends meet and take care of their families. And so there's so much that we can learn from Cuba, from the Cuban people, and it is in our interest, our political interest, our long-term interest with allies and diplomacy to do everything we can to make sure Cuba succeeds as a country. So thank you again to the ACERE team. Thank you to my friend Maria Jose Espinoza, and to all of you on the call for your interest in this. And let me hand it back to you.
And thank you so much, Congresswoman Jayapal, for sharing your experiences and your analyses there. So next, we're going to be going to our panelist, Denise Delgado, who is a PhD in public policy and research coordinator with the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Denise has studied the Cuban diaspora's economic engagement with the island and has published on U.S. remittances policies towards Cuba. Also has researched the nexus of digital platforms, cryptocurrencies, and remittances in Cuba during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the Cuban diaspora's role in the context of changes on the island. Denise consults for the International Organization for Migration and has been invited to present in Congress about the impacts of the closure of Western Union on the Cuban people. She has also been a guest speaker at various universities, including Harvard University, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University. So with that, I'll turn it over to Denise Delgado.
Thank you very much, Manny. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to ACERE for organizing today's briefing, as well as to the audience for joining. I'm very honored to be and have the opportunity to speak with you about this topic that is with salient importance. Today, I will begin by outlining the current socioeconomic landscape in Cuba, including the social demographic complexities as well, and will provide a comprehensive overview of the factors that have been contributing to the recent migratory wave. And I'm also going to delve into some economic and political motivations behind the current migratory wave, as well as the role of remittances in this context. So thank you for your attention, and I will begin. So as Congresswoman has mentioned before, since the COVID-19 pandemic context, as well as the implementation of some of the US sanctions on Cuba, there have been some increase of the economic crisis in Cuba, and some indicators of this economic crisis are related to both internal factors as well as external factors, such as the US policies towards Cuba. The Cuban economy has seen a GDP contraction since 2020 with a decline of 11% of the GDP. And while there was a recovery between 2021 and 2022, the Cuban economy contracted again by 2% in 2023, which has been indicating a persistent recession on the island. In parallel to the GDP contraction, we also are seeing a high inflation with prices of products that have been increasing more quickly than personal incomes. And to that also adds the macroeconomic instability on the island with a budget deficit. There are multiple exchange rates with a competing between the formal market and the informal market, and a lack of external financing. And all of these situations also adds to a lack of production, and there is a sectoral crisis, especially in agricultural and the energy sectors, with shortages in food, and the food that is available is more expensive than previous years because of the inflation. There is also lack of medicine, as Congresswoman could see in her trip to Cuba. There are long lines sometimes to get the food, to get the medicine at the pharmacy when the medicine is available. And all this has resulted in a nutrition and health crisis on the island. And there is also a decline on the imports. So all this brings the situation of getting difficulties on having access to food and medicine. And regarding the energy sector, there has been also insufficient availability, and the infrastructure has been deteriorated. So that has led to frequent blackouts that have been affecting the Cuban people since the last years on the island. And all this economic crisis has an impact, a direct impact on the social demographic composition on the island. So we have been seeing some changes, an increase of the low birth rate, but also an aging population and aging and more vulnerable for the elderly population in Cuba, with a lack of food and medicine, as well as high levels of migration, especially among those who are young and a skilled labor force. So this current exodus has been motivated by the current economic crisis, but also by other aspects as political reasons, especially after July 11 protests, as well as some people have the desire to reunify with their family members who have been living abroad for a long time, or because of professional and educational opportunities, especially young Cubans has found abroad. So the current migratory wave is the biggest migratory wave of Cubans in the last 60 years, and this is even higher than all previous Cuban migratory wave since the 1960s together. It has some differences compared to previous migratory wave. This current exodus is much more diverse in terms of economic status of migrants, age and gender, as well as professions. We are seeing a more diverse group, racial diverse group, compared to previous migratory wave, who were mainly of professional white Cubans, as well as we are seeing more vulnerable populations migrating. Sometimes there are families who travel together, or they have joined the caravans crossing the borders together as couples, and even we have seen individuals as minors who have been coming to the United States alone. And based on CBP, since 2021, there has been over 6,000 Cuban minors trying to reach out the border alone. So this brings the idea of how risky has been the current migration wave. And just taking into account between 2021 and 2024, there has been at least 645,000 encounters of Cuban nationals at the US border. So in order to manage this irregular and risky migration and support more regular pathways and more secure pathways, the Biden administration has granted human parole to hundreds and thousands of Cubans. So far, around 100,000 Cubans have been granted the parole. And this has been very helpful because, of course, this diminishes the risk of migration in irregular ways, crossing the borders. But as Congresswoman has mentioned, of course, that we want to increase more secure ways for Cubans who want to migrate to do it, but also the possibility to stay if they want to stay. So one of the ways that I saw and conducting research through the last 10 years is that some Cuban migrants have mentioned to me that while they had access to non-immigrant visas, they were doing circular migration. They were traveling to the United States and then they came back because their intention was not to stay in the United States, but just to visit. Since the non-immigrant visas issuing decreased importantly, they decided to migrate. So I just want to point on that because I think it's important for policy, migration policies. And in addition to this aspect, the current migratory wave have probably added at least 5% to the total Cuban population abroad, and we could estimate that there is about 20% of Cubans who live now abroad, not in Cuba. So that would be about 1 every 5 Cubans born in Cuba. So therefore, the social demographic impact of this wave has decreased the total Cuban population on the island. And while there is not official data on this, some recent independent studies have suggested that in Cuba, this is not an island of 11 million Cubans anymore, but it is probably around 8.6 million Cuban. And I would like to conclude here with a brief reflection on the crucial role of remittances and its significance in providing recipient families with opportunities to remain in Cuba if they want, as an option. First, remittances plays a crucial role as a source income for many Cuban families, and it has been vital for their survival strategies during this context of the crisis. In my research, in my doctoral study, I could see that Cubans in Miami sent on average 2,100 per year, which is in the normal range of other migrants from Latin America living in the United States. And Cubans have been sending money, but also food, medicine, combos, phone recharges, so they can stay connected to their family. But something that caught my attention is that Cuban migrants prefer sending cash dollars, and the mechanisms to do that are very limited and mostly through the informal channels. The other aspect that I saw in my research is that remittances have been supporting the development of private enterprises. And some of the migrants I have talked to, they mentioned they prefer hiring a family member to collaborate with them so they can offer them a decent salary. And this brings the idea of breaking the cycle of dependency that sometimes is around remittances, because paying their family members or supporting family business on the island also empower their family and create new opportunities for them. And just to finalize this, how it is related to US policies, helping or not the development of private enterprises in Cuba. We know that in an effort to support the Cuban people, OFAC implemented some regulatory amendments on the divided administration to enhance internet freedom, but also to support independent entrepreneurs by allowing them to open, maintain, and use US bank accounts remotely. They also would have access to online payment platforms, and this has been a long-standing request from Cuban private sector so they can improve their businesses. However, despite these regulatory changes, my interviewers have mentioned that they have not been able to open those bank accounts in the United States, and this is mainly because US banks are hesitant to open those accounts since Cuba is still on the list of state sponsor of terrorism. So there are two levels that I think that should be connected between OFAC and those banking institutions to move along that policy, the implementation of that policy, that it actually and genuinely help the Cuban people and support the private sector. So with that reflection, I'm going to stop my presentation and leave it time for other participants.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you for sharing your firsthand data and all your insights and contributions, which are very invaluable. We're going to next move to our next panelist, Susan Eckstein, who is a professor emeritus in the Pardee School of Global Studies and in the sociology department at Boston University. She has written numerous books and articles on political economic developments in Cuba, Cuban immigrants, immigration policy, and the impacts of Latin American revolutions. Her books include Cuban Privilege, The Making of Immigrant Inequality in America, The Immigrant Divide, How Cuban Americans Changed the U.S. in Their Homeland, as well as many, many more. Susan Eckstein is also the former president of the Latin American Studies Association and received the association's Lifetime Achievement Award in 2023. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Susan Eckstein.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a very difficult topic to be discussing. I do not want to, the problem of not being the first to speak is I don't want to repeat what others have said. I guess I want to underline a few points that were said and then try to address some issues that have not yet been mentioned. So the first thing I want to say is, well, I will begin by saying Cuba is in crisis, but Cubans' problems are US problems. It is not it's not their problems as opposed to our problems, but we are part of their problems, and hopefully we can be part of their solution. I say we're part of their problems because of the issues that have been mentioned, the impact. The U.S. is by no means the only factor contributing to the crisis in Cuba. It's just incorrect to give that impression. But the issue is we are part of that problem, and we can, in that respect, be hopefully part of the solution to their problems, because if things are going the way they're going, things are going to get worse in Cuba, even worse, and migration to the United States is going to be picked up. And in that sense, I want to say, in reflecting on Cuban immigration, which I have written a couple books about on Cuban immigrants, and my most recent book is on U.S.-Cuban immigration policy over the years, is that the U.S. has implemented certain policies, such as under Clinton, when by agreement with Cuba, which is important to mention, that this is not just U.S. autocratically determining policy. The U.S. was able to, for all intents and purposes, stop immigration by sea to the United States, which is difficult. I mean, it's difficult, it's dangerous. People die by being bitten by sharks, etc. That has increased recently, but it certainly hasn't reached the levels that it was in 1994 under Clinton, when over 30,000 Cubans were coming in the so-called rafter crisis. So by agreement, the U.S. and Cuba have opened up legal migration, in which the U.S. Committed to admit a minimum of 20,000 Cubans a year. And that served to, plus the U.S. Policing the Florida Straits, really contributed to a dramatic near closing of migration by sea, which is how most Cubans has come. But Cubans are smart. They find other ways. When one means to come to the United States closes, they turn to others. And that's what happened when they started the so-called wet foot, dry foot policy, meaning that Cubans would go to other countries, such as and then go through Mexico to the border, and then come to the US with dry feet. The wet feet policy had shut down. The dry feet policy remained open. It had been in existence before. And then we had massive migration to the United States that under Obama had tens of thousands of Cubans coming by foot across the border. They came across the border, showed that they were Cuban, and they were paroled into the country, meaning they got temporary entry. And then thanks to the Cuban Adjustment Act passed under President Johnson in 1966, after a year, they could qualify for a legal permanent residency and then citizenship. As a result, actually, the citizenship rate among Cubans is much higher than among other immigrants, because they've had this legal pathway. So it looked again under when Obama, at the end of his administration, ended parole for Cubans. It looked like finally Cuban migration would resemble migration from other countries, meaning that the legal pathway would be there and unauthorized immigration would be limited. Well, that seemed to work briefly. But then once again, Cubans determined to come into the United States found a new route. And the new route that they pursued was asylum seeking. And that, I think, was following the Central Americans who had been entering the United States claiming asylum. Now, what was unique to the Cubans is if they could make an asylum claim, in a year and a day, their asylum case would not have been heard yet because of the backlog. But because they were Cubans, had access to the Cuban Adjustment Act, they had their own way through that asylum path without ever proving that they were seeking, that they qualified for asylum. They were able to become legal permanent residents and then citizens. So, I mean, it is remarkable the way in which Cubans, through their own initiative, have found their own ways to come. So now we are left with the situation of what's happened. I guess I want to emphasize the crisis in Cuba. It is real. And we need to do all we can to help it, because if for no other, first of all, for moral reasons, and they are our closest of neighbors, but aside from that, the problems in Cuba become our problems because of migration. And if Cubans can't come legally, they find, as I've highlighted, new unauthorized paths to come. And the Congress has not retracted the Cuban Adjustment Act. So until they do that, unless and until they do that, they do have a path to citizenship that no other unauthorized immigrants have. So I want to emphasize a few things under Biden administration to commend them in a sense for a few things. One is to open up remittances again, which is absolutely essential, because Cuban families are highly dependent on their families in the United States for basic survival. So that is good. It is good that the Biden administration is opening up the visa processing again, which Trump had closed down, resuming family reunification, which was a policy implemented under George W. Bush that Trump kind of suspended. And then most significantly, opening so-called legal pathways, in particular the humanitarian 2-year parole program. Again, this is not just for Cuba. This one is not just for Cubans. It's also for Haitians, Venezuelans, and Nicaraguans. But unique to the Cubans, they alone of those groups can use that pathway to become lawful permanent residents. Now, the parole is a temporary program, but after a year, they can become lawful permanent residents and then citizens, thanks to the Cuban Adjustment Act. So this is terrific. The problem is under Biden's humanitarian parole program shared with those other 3 countries, the numbers are insufficient to meet the demand of Cubans who want to get to the United States. So it's not resolving the migration problem. It is helping to resolve it, but it leaves it unresolved because only 360,000 Cubans can come in. I'm sorry, 360,000 people from Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Haiti can come in under the humanitarian parole program. That's 360,000. Well, we've already heard over 600,000 Cubans are coming. So it's a dent in the right direction. It doesn't in itself resolve the problem. And it's not sufficient to let people, convince Cubans to only pursue an authorized path. So that's one thing I want to say. It's insufficient. It hasn't been mentioned, this I-228 immigration regulation, which is one way in which Cubans have been able to get into the country. The problem is the U.S. has become very arbitrary, or the Border Patrol people. I think it's really on the grassroots level that's happening. They are very arbitrary in their giving of parole, giving of this I-228 A status. And so there's a lot of ambiguity, which is very anxiety evoking for Cubans, but also may encourage them to come because they think, well, they may get a chance to get the parole and to get in. So I think that's something that really has to be worked out, to make it really at the grassroots level, to make sure there's a consistent policy. So then there is discussion of parole in place, which has been promoted by some of the Cuban American Congress people in Florida, or Congress people in Florida. The problem is, yes, it would be nice to get parole in place. But why should the Cubans be getting it and not others? I think that has to be thought through. In my book, The Cuban Privilege, The Making of Immigrant Inequality in America, I detail under administration after administration how Cubans were getting entitlements that other groups weren't, which isn't fair. And the original reasons which were rooted in the Cold War, well, decades have passed since the Cold War ended, and we are stuck in this policy towards Cuba in terms of the embargo, in terms of these migration policies that need to be worked out. So, in short, I guess I would say we need to really get our immigration policies to be consistent and fair. And we need to open up more legal pathways if we want the unauthorized pathways to go down. If they don't, Cuba will continue to empty out, and it will exacerbate the problems of the country, because they are losing Cubans across the board, but they are losing, as the Congresswoman said, they're losing their doctors, they're losing their teachers. It's getting harder now to get for children in Cuba to get us educated and to get health care. These were the stellar things of the revolution that justified the revolution, was health, welfare, and education. And now Cuba cannot even say that they are delivering this to their people. So there is work to be done, and hopefully it will be done to make for a better and fairer policy. But I think the Biden administration has been on the path to doing it. They just need to do more and fast.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eckstein. We really appreciate your contributions here and your insights. We're going to be moving to our next panelist, who is Rafael Brunel. Rafael is the main writer for The Hill, the newspaper, The Hill, and their Latino section, where he covers various issues, including relations between the U.S. and Latin America. Rafael previously worked at the United Press International as a managing editor, and before entering journalism, he practiced law in his native Mexico City. We're really happy to have Rafael here today with us, and Rafael, please take it away.
Thank you. And again, the tough act to follow. I'll try not to repeat things as well. But one thing that's been explained very well here, but I just want to underline it, is migration from any country is always multifactorial. And the factors differ. For instance, in Mexico, you have economic and security reasons that are primordially moving migration. In countries like Nicaragua, Venezuela, you also have political reasons, so sort of political persecution, as well as economic insecurity in those cases. But it's always sort of a balance of the three, and what, if you use the push factor, pull factor model in the push factors. Now, Cuba is very unique because all the anecdotal evidence, and I'm sure it's quantifiable, but that is not the job of a journalist. But the trends seem to be the economic issue is the number one push factor, and the most relevant push factor. And what makes that unique, I mean, because most countries around the continent at least have some economic woes, or partial economic woes anyway. What makes it unique is there are specific government policies that are implemented that directly affect that economy. Obviously, you have the embargo, or as the Cuban government would call it, the blockade. And the other side is you do, as the Congresswoman mentioned, have some economic policies from the Cuban government that are definitely taking their place in their economy, and obviously something that hasn't been successful. The two sides, one will tell you it's all the blockade. The other side will tell you it's 100% on the on mismanagement and corruption. Obviously, the answer is somewhere in the middle, again, to be quantified. That is important because the Cubans, Cuba and the United States talk. They talk a lot. They talk about migration. They talk about security. They talk about drug trade, management of the Florida Straits. There's a million reasons why they need to talk, and they keep doing it. These negotiations on migration that have been going on, what they've resulted in is also that Cuba is also unique in as a recipient of deportees or removals, to use a proper term. So since we renewed deportation flights to Cuba, there have been 707, that's it, Cubans returned in 15 flights in 23 and 24. And the flights, as we all know, they're one a month, and they have been one a month since April 23. But the key thing about these flights is they usually have about 50 or fewer than 50 people in them each. They're just not that packed for all the reasons already explained, that Cubans don't get removed as much because you have to get to the point where you have an order of deportation, and basically anybody who stays here for a year and a day and doesn't get in trouble with the law, they won't get to that point in their immigration paperwork. So they're not going to be on one of those flights. You compare it to, I compare this to deportations to Haiti, for no other reason that geographically they're similar. The planes right now going to Haiti, they've been suspended again, but up to the most recent ones, they also had about 50 people each. And since December 2022, there were 696 Haitians returned to Haiti. Now, those numbers seem really similar, but the Biden administration has actually deported about 27,000 Haitians. There was that period from September of 21 to December of 22 where there were 25,000 Haitians deported, and it was the biggest deportation operation to Haiti. And obviously that has to do with well, there wasn't really a strong government. The United States was propping up then the government that was sort of in charge. So they weren't about to say no. There was no negotiation, and it was easier to deport Haitians because they could get further in their deportation paperwork. And there's one thing I really want to remark on. There's a million things to go on the state sponsor of terrorism list. Clearly has been a factor, one of the many factors pushing the Cuban economy in the wrong direction. I think one of the big elements of this lack of access to financial markets. It's reduced European tourism because Europeans have a visa-free entry to the United States called ESTA. But if a European has a Cuban stamp on their passport, or if there's any record of them having gone to Cuba, they are no longer eligible for ESTA. So if they want to come here on business or tourism, they have to go through the visa process, which anyone who's gone through it is it's not great. But the interesting thing here is of all the policies that are affecting the Cuban economy negatively, the state sponsor of terrorism list, it was, as mentioned before, it was implemented by the Trump administration about a week before they left, and crucially after the events of January 6th. And it was a major policy decision that made that mess and impeachment and whatnot. And the only read I can come to on that is the Trump administration knew they were leaving a hot potato to the Biden administration. They had not done that before, because they knew it was a key part of enhancing sanctions against Cuba that would have a migratory effect, and they didn't want to deal with that migratory effect. So they just left it to the Biden administration and basically dared the Biden administration to make a major pro-Cuba move, and in amid the political, especially the politics of South Florida. The Biden administration has not done that. They've done, as discussed, they've taken other steps, but not that big one. And the Cuban government has been very clear. They haven't telegraphed. They have megaphoned that is their number one priority, and they've also more telegraphed a willingness to sit down at the table and discuss any issue, whereas before they wanted to segment discussions, whether on the economic, on human rights, separate things. I think the potential for removal from that list has put them in a position that they have pretty much openly offered the Biden administration open talks.
Thank you, Rafael. We really appreciate your insights there. And we're going to move on now to our last panelist for this briefing, Maria Jose Espinosa, who is an economist and foreign policy expert and the executive director of the Center for Engagement and Advocacy in the Americas. Maria is also a senior non-resident fellow with the Center for International Policy and was recognized by New America as one of the 2020 Latino National Security and Foreign Policy Next Generation leaders. So we're really happy and lucky to have Maria here. Go ahead, Maria.
Thank you, Manny, and thanks to all of my colleagues and to Congresswoman Jayapal for this timely conversation. I was asked to talk a little bit about what U.S. policy can do, and I think my colleagues have covered a lot of that. Cuba, it's clear that it's currently facing an unprecedented economic and humanitarian crisis. And while the Cuban government is primarily responsible for economic mismanagement and oppressive practices, it is clear that the role of U.S. policy toward Cuba is also significant, as is the impact of blanket U.S. sanctions worsened during the Trump administration. And we're focusing here today on U.S. policy, so we can control a couple of things, and in this case, is influencing U.S. policy. It is urgent that we focus on what can be done unilaterally from the U.S. side to better the lives of Cubans living in Cuba and the U.S., and maintaining U.S. sanctions, including the embargo, has come at the expense of the most vulnerable populations in Cuba. Denise touched on this a little bit. It affects families, women, elder populations, Black, LGBTQI Cubans, and really hinders progress towards a more fair and inclusive society. And these populations are also the most affected by internal dynamics and failed domestic policies. Wanted to also mention a couple of things, and putting Cuban migration in context, I think is important. It is not unique to Cuba to see in the region, Latin America and the Caribbean are seeing complex migratory population movements that include refugees, include asylum seekers, economic migrants, and other types of migrants. This also means that there are mixed reasons why people go where they go. It is not one model that will fit all. Wanted to say that since 2010, no region has experienced a more significant relative increase in international migration than Latin America and the Caribbean. The majority of Latin American and Caribbean migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees live in the Americas. And I think it's important also to see the numbers. The numbers of migrants and asylum seekers nearly doubled from 8.3 million in 2010 to 16.3 million in 2022. There are figures by UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, that more than 2 in 5 new asylum applications in 2022 were made by nationals from Latin America and the Caribbean, notably from Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And the number of Cuban asylum seekers worldwide saw a sharp 6-fold increase in 2022. So this is a context, and this being a focus for the Biden administration, a regional response and cooperation on migration. Again, it is crucial and urgent for U.S. policy to contribute positively by improving conditions on the ground, avoiding restrictive measures that harm the most vulnerable populations, and also harm U.S. national interests without effectively addressing the humanitarian situation or alleviating the current migratory exodus. And we're seeing the numbers that keep growing, as my colleagues quoted. So the urgency of addressing these issues cannot be overstated. As Congresswoman Jayapal rightly emphasized, this must be achieved through smart policy and through dialogue. And the Biden administration has taken steps, including the May 2024 announcement of measures that are aimed at bolstering support for Cuban entrepreneurs by expanding access to internet-based services, facilitating financial transactions, supporting independent entrepreneurship. But I wanted to focus on a couple of things. Last month, SEDA and the Washington Office on Latin America hosted a group of civil society leaders in Washington. And the delegation offered a number of recommendations. And I think it's important to listen to the people on the ground and really what's impacting them in terms of U.S. policy. One thing would be to facilitate humanitarian aid and remove restrictions that limit civil society organizations providing assistance and promoting international aid as well, collaborating with the European Union and others to provide direct food and medical supplies will be key, given the conditions on the ground. I think it's important to emphasize the resumption of high-level diplomatic dialogue. The resumption of the migration talks by the Biden administration is an important first step But before President Trump halted the United States and Cuba were engaged in a wide range of dialogues on more than a dozen issues related to the 22 bilateral agreements that were signed between 2015 and 2017. Most of which are still in effect, but have not been implemented. So beyond migration, we should reactivate talks on human rights and other issues of mutual interest. This could include discussions on releasing political prisoners, cooperating on public health, agriculture. I agree with Congresswoman Jayapal and the rest of my colleagues. Removing Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorism list is essential. The presence of Cuba on this list severely restricts all economic transactions involving Cuba, both humanitarian and also business-oriented. It creates obstacles for the delivery of humanitarian relief on the island, and we've heard this from civil society on the ground, from religious groups here in the US. It can also prevent independent Cuban entrepreneurs from accessing international banking services and foreign nationals from visiting Cuba without losing their US visa waivers. That's what Rafael was mentioning. It affects travel to Cuba from over 40 countries, including Japan and all European Union countries. I think also the removal of Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism would improve the atmosphere for US-Cuba bilateral dialogue and again, to expand beyond migration and law enforcement, include discussions on other topics. And finally, I think there is a need to support safe and orderly migration from Cuba in other ways. For example, it is imperative to increase the capacity of the US Embassy in Havana to address the massive backlog of requests of Cuban immigration visas, also to start the processing of non-immigrant visas, reducing the high risk and cost associated with traveling to other US embassies in the region, and help alleviate family separation, support family reunification, really allow the US to more directly and actively support the Cuban people. Also, another mission that Congresswoman Jayapal mentioned was the reopening of the refugee section that administered the US Refugee Admission Program in Cuba would be key as well for some populations that need immediate access to asylum in the US. I'm gonna stop here, but I'm happy to answer any questions about any further measures. I don't wanna repeat what others have already said.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was a very thorough analysis, and as well as a lot of suggested action items as well that I think was very helpful. With that, we're going to go ahead and transition to the Q&A section of the briefing, and we'll have a chance here to explore a few questions and have some panelists expand on some thoughts here as well. I think, so first question, which I think is a sort of a now combination of a few questions we see in the chat, is relating to the state sponsors of terrorism designation, which each of the panelists and also Congresswoman Jayapal has touched upon. So the question is essentially asking about, why is it that we, as we're able to identify this designation and its consequences, why do we think that we're seeing still some resistance, it seems like, to the change in that designation? And so if any panelists wants to jump in here, maybe just give some additional thoughts on that designation, its impacts, and the the potential sort of benefits there can be from changing that designation.
I can give a very simple answer to that. It's bad optics. The Biden administration doesn't need to do that as much as it needs not to give Republicans another line of attack. So until that political calculation changes, I see it as very hard that Cuba would be removed.
Thank you, Rafael. And Maria, did you have any additional thoughts on that? I know that's something you also touched upon in your presentation.
No, I agree. It is not a priority at the moment. I think there was a question in the chat about timing and the process of reviewing the designation, and really it involves several steps that can be quite lengthy, and depending on various factors, including political and diplomatic consideration. Once the decision is made by the State Department, the secretary is required to submit a report to Congress justifying the decision. And I think there is a mandatory 45-day waiting period during which Congress can review and challenge the decision if necessary. So that's answering a question on timing. Again, not clear. It took several months to remove Cuba back in 2015, but you have 45 days at least, you know, that with Congress.
There is another question that is related to if there is a chance that the Biden policy could change in the time left in the administration before the election, and maybe it's not, if not removed from the list, I'm thinking about this particularly opportunity for Cuban entrepreneurs and people on the island to open bank accounts. I think it could be a more straightforward and easy step to that the administration bring a bank from the United States to collaborate with this policy and make it available to the Cuban entrepreneurs to know. So get the engagement of one or two banks from the United States that would be open to allow the bank accounts of Cubans on the island in the United States. And it's not related to removing Cuba from the list. Of course, that major policy would help a lot any other transactions, but just bringing a bank, a U.S. bank would be helpful.
Thank you so much, Denise, there. And we'll jump to this next question here that I wanted to see if we can touch upon. There's a question relating to Cuba and the effects of sort of food shortages. So the asker of this question was pointing to how UNICEF has included Cuba in its child nutrition report for the first time and finds that 9% of children in Cuba suffer from severe food poverty. So the question is, what do we think can be done in terms of public health cooperation with Cuba to sort of help alleviate this situation?
I can share a couple of ideas. I think that's a question from Gail. So I think she has more answers than I do on public health cooperation. But there are a couple of things, including working with international partners, UN agencies, and others. The restrictions that apply for the private sector, individual Cubans, also apply for any entities trying to send humanitarian aid to Cuba, working with civil society. So there are several financial restrictions. There are shielding effects of, as being on the state sponsor of terrorism list. There are over-compliance issues as well. And so in terms of public health cooperation, I do think the U.S. should encourage more of the partners in the region and in the world to support some of the agencies there. There were calls from the World Food Program, I believe, on, from Cuba actually, to get more support from the World Food Program. But many of those conversations and potential cooperation are hindered by the embargo and blanket sanctions. There is also a question on the willingness in Cuba to establish cooperation with different agencies and internal dynamics in terms of, in this case, food supply. Denise mentioned what's happening in the agricultural sector, what's happening with the private sector. So I do think it has to come from both sides.
If I can add really quick on the food security issue. There have been, at some point, there were rumors and whispers and actual conversations, but some Republican members of Congress and senators from plain states and from Midwestern states have at least eyed with curiosity the idea of opening up the Cuban market, that's 11 million people, to U.S. products like corn. So there's a window of potential bipartisanship there, but I mean, I wouldn't bet on it.
Well, thank you, everyone. So for sake of time, we're going to move into the calls to action for this briefing, but we really appreciate all the attendees for their wonderful questions. We did really get a lot of great questions here that unfortunately, some we weren't able to get to. But if you are interested in helping ease the multiple crises that are affecting the Cuban people and tackling some of the root causes of migration, please consider some of these following calls to action, which we will also be putting into the chat as well. We'll include there some helpful links. So first, the importance of contacting the White House and the State Department to request the following, which is one, to take Cuba off of the state sponsor of terrorism list. That was discussed in depth here. This designation stifles business and humanitarian transactions with Cuba, and making this change could go a long way, as described by our wonderful panelists. And two, calling for the White House and State Department to facilitate humanitarian aid and increase operations at the U.S. Embassy in Havana. So visa backlogs and the lack of regular non-immigrant visa processing in Cuba has really added to this irregular migration that we've been discussing, and of course has been putting a lot of lives, especially Cuban lives, at risk. So making that move would be very vital. So next point is to, especially for the staffers here, to sign the Dear Colleague letter on Colombia and the state-sponsored terrorism list. So going to urge your boss or member of Congress to join this letter, which has already been signed by at least 34 members, possibly more now, and co-led by Caesar, McGovern, Pocan, Johnson, Skakowski, and DeLauro, all to lift Cuba's state sponsor of terrorism designation, and given Cuba's key role in helping broker Colombia's ongoing peace process. The next action item to download and disseminate ACERE's fact sheet, which we have on U.S. policy and Cuban migration. So making use of those tools that we provide on our website, acere.org. So that's ACERE.org. And we have that sort of provided easily on our website. For Senate staff, to urge your boss to sign on to Amy Klobuchar's bipartisan bill, which is called the Freedom to Export to Cuba Act, which would help lift the U.S. trade embargo, which of course stifles trade, travel, and investment between our two countries, as well as limits export earnings of U.S. producers. And as we've seen for over 60 years now, done very little to actually advance human rights in Cuba, and actually can contribute to the humanitarian crisis there in Cuba. And so again, to learn more, please visit our website, acere.org. You can also subscribe to stay up to date on U.S.-Cuba policy. You can also reach out to us at allianceforcuba@acere.org. Again, that email is allianceforcuba@acere.org. And with that, that concludes our briefing. I want to thank you all for joining us today on this really important topic. And I would especially like to thank all of our wonderful panelists for sharing their insights, their experiences, their data, their research, and helping us have a much better understanding of these important issues. And also thank you to ACERE's team for organizing this briefing. So with that, that's it. Thank you so much, y'all. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.